Welcome the chosen ones. Curiosity did not just kill the cat. This time, it attempted to interpret a holy blueprint and pay the ultimate price. Allow that to sink in, because what I'm going to say is not simply unusual. It is spiritually surgical. Someone lost their life, not from disease or accident, but from an obsession with you. Yes, you heard it correctly. Now, before you laugh it off or say, "There's no way I could have that effect," let me strike you with this. Energy psychology research confirms that long-term preoccupation with particular people may lead to brain exhaustion, identity disintegration, and spiritual madness. Imagine folks out here experiencing spiritual convulsions, trying to figure out why you don't crack under strain. It wasn't simply someone being inquisitive. They weren't just watching. They were engaging in spiritual trespass. And you didn't stroll about like a puzzle. You walked about like a magnificent barrier. Here's the kicker. While they were pursuing your artwork, their own turmoil engulfed them. They attempted to reverse engineer you, replicating your movements and mentality, but not your soul. It is not downloadable. You aren't a tutorial. You are a temple. Now I understand what you were thinking. This can't be genuine. Nobody dies of obsession. However, when someone interferes with a frequency they do not respect, or when they tap into energy world that they are not spiritually cleared to access, the reaction is not always symbolic. Sometimes it is lethal. So sit tight, for in the next minutes, we'll reveal a truth that has been whispered in spiritual realms for years. Some individuals harm themselves by studying what God created. And you choose one. You were never intended to be figured out. You were supposed to be feared, respected, and left alone. Let's get to it. First and foremost, they were not studying you. They tried to reprogram you. They weren't simply observing you because they were intrigued. They were observing you because they were attempting to decipher your code. To them, you were not a person. You were a project. You remained quiet at all times, no matter what you did or said. They captured it as data. They believed that if they studied you long enough, they would find out how you were wired. They believed they could tear you down like a machine, take away the mystery, and control the result. But you were never meant to be solved. You were never intended to be predictable. You were not created to fit within anyone's framework. And this is what drove them nuts. The fact is that they were not studying you because they admired you. They were analyzing you with the intention of reprogramming you. They sought to alter your nature, disrupt your instincts, and transform you into a version of yourself that they could control. That's why they paid such careful attention. They were looking for a flaw, a moment of vulnerability, something they may use to change your settings. But here's the deal. They could not discover one. The more they attempted to limit you to their knowledge, the more your spirit rejected the box. They attempted to trap you inside. They continued digging and digging. They broke their own code rather than yours. They were so immersed in your energy that they lost sight of their own identities. They lost track of who they were before becoming fascinated with you. Your resilience became their misery. Your peace was offensive. Your capacity to remain up in the face of adversity made them wonder why their own lives were still so difficult. And instead of mending, they became antagonistic. Instead of backing down, they doubled down. But your concept was never intended to be replicated. Your blueprint was spiritually encrypted. So, as they were attempting to change your soul, their own system broke. You were never the one who murdered them. It was the weight of their own preoccupation. You did not fight them. You did not assault them. You had no idea how far gone they were. But they perished trying to figure out how someone like you existed, how someone who had gone through hell could still have paradise in their bones. That mystery put an end to their lives. And you simply continued walking. Number 2, they assumed you were an equation, but you were a surprise. They assumed you were a puzzle. Maybe it was a bit difficult, but they could figure it out soon. They believed that if they searched hard enough, they would discover the formula, the blueprint, and the step-by-step instructions on how to operate. But this was their first error. You aren't an equation. You're not composed of predictable patterns or rational consequences. You are a living revelation. You disclose what was concealed. You find out what's phony. You bring to light what others want to conceal. And the reality is, they were not prepared for what being with you would reveal about themselves. They expected you to make sense, but the selected ones seldom do. You aren't loud, but you are strong. You are not aggressive, but your presence is heavy. You stroll into a room and move items without attempting. You talk, and they either wake up or leave. That cannot be explained. That is heavenly force at work. When individuals who are spiritually detached come into contact with that kind of frequency, it shakes them. They are deeply affected by the interruption. Their soul begins to glitch. Their thoughts start to spin. Instead of confronting the internal conflict, they attempt to shift the attention back to you. They begin examining you as if something is wrong. It seems like you're concealing something. Because, in their opinion, no one should have so much tranquility, clarity, or authority unless they are faking. But you weren't kidding. That's what caused them problems. You were real. You weren't made. You were molded. They couldn't believe someone like you could exist, particularly given all you'd gone through. And when they discovered they couldn't break the encryption, they were upset. That irritation grew into an obsession. And that fixation led to spiritual breakdown, since what they were attempting to study was never intended to be understood. It was intended to be respected. Trying to figure you out was like staring straight at the sun. They believed they could manage it. They felt they were strong enough. They didn't understand you were carrying light that they hadn't earned. So, as they were attempting to tear you down into bits, something in them broke. You did not confuse them. You convicted them. And some individuals would sooner die than face the reality you showed just by living. Number 3. Your energy was their remedy, but they overdid it. They weren't simply watching you. You were their getaway. They treated your energy like a narcotic. Being near you, hearing your voice, and seeing how you moved gave them a high. They couldn't get somewhere else. You didn't even realize it. But they were feeding off of your presence. They were hooked to your calmness, shine, and strength. You were their hidden source of life in a world that seemed lifeless to them. But addiction comes as a cost, and they overdose, trying to keep up with something their soul was not designed to handle. They didn't know how to ground themselves, so they continued attempting to connect with you. You were their recharge, fix, and comfort zone. Every time their world fell apart, they looked for your light. Instead of mending themselves, they relied heavily on your energy as a crutch. It transitioned from inspiration to dependence, adoration to addiction. They were no longer simply watching. They were exhausting. And since you're programmed to assist and heal, you probably didn't realize it at first. You just felt exhausted around them. Heavier. Something seemed odd, but you couldn't quite describe it. That's because they never approached you with a pure spirit. They did not wish to develop. They wanted to leech. When you drew back or when life dragged you apart, it seemed like retreat to them. Your disappearance impacted them more than they anticipated. They didn't just miss you. They plummeted because they never learned to produce their own light. They had based their stability on your energy, and when it was gone, they couldn't bear the gloom of their own lives. They felt they could continue to suck from your spirit without consequence. They assumed being with you would miraculously silence their demons. However, you were not sent to be their source. You were a sign, a reminder that recovery is attainable, that tranquility is genuine. But they didn't want the procedure. They just wanted the power. And when you stopped pouring, the addiction overpowered them. Not because you did anything wrong, but because they attempted to survive on something that was never intended to be digested without alteration. Number 4. They perished attempting to copy something they refused to appreciate. They did not appreciate you. They envied you. And rather than learning from your path, they attempted to replicate your goal. They saw how you handled yourself, how others attracted toward you, and how your presence changed the atmosphere and spaces. But they never questioned why you moved the way you did. They did not want your knowledge. They wanted your findings. They did not desire your soul. They want your brilliance. However, the light they observed was not surface. It was fashioned in the dark, through grief, loss, and solitary nights that no one witnessed. They bypassed all of that and sought to wear your spirit as a costume, hoping no one would notice. They didn't grasp that genuine power is based on sincerity. And what you carry cannot be falsified. Not for long. They attempted to replicate your tone, walk, and insight. They replicated your words, mimicked your stance, and even reflected your feelings. But they were performing. And performance has an expiry date. Eventually, the energy they were attempting to emulate began demanding money. And when the cost became apparent, when spiritual warfare arrived, when inner fights occurred, they were unprepared. They had not earned it. They had not survived. What? You survived. They wanted your crown, not your cross. They wanted your brightness, not your loneliness. They want your insight, but not the scars that produced it. Here's the hard reality. When you imitate the holy while harboring resentment and entitlement, the spiritual retribution is severe. They were attempting to represent something completely while brimming with pride and hatred. That is spiritual suicide, since the energy you carry rejects falsehood. It reveals the fake. It refuses to be housed with someone who disrespects its origin. They perish not in the flesh, but in spirit, identity, and instability. Because you can't become what you secretly despise. You cannot take grace and expect it to defend you. And they discovered the hard way that pretending to be selected is a game that always ends in failure. Not because you curse them, but because they touch something precious without respect. Number 5, their ego could not withstand a reality. You reflected back. You did not assault them. You didn't make them public. You didn't confront them or even attempt to injure them. All you did was exist, and it alone shocked them to the core. Why? Because being near you pushed them to face what they had previously denied seeing in themselves. You were not a threat, as the world understands it. You were a mirror that reflected the reality rather than flattering or filtering it. For those who live in falsehoods, this is terrible. You didn't even need to speak. Your vitality, clarity, and self-awareness, those were loud enough. You stayed solid in your truth, causing their whole identity to seem shaky. They all donned masks, played parts, and created illusions. They began to crack as you entered the room. You didn't do it on purpose, but your genuineness revealed their performance. Your essay exposed their turmoil. Your self-control showed their impulsiveness, while your progress highlighted their stagnation. They couldn't withstand that degree of exposure. Their ego was like a house of cards, fragile, theatrical, and quickly endangered. So they frightened when you pushed the truth too near. Their first inclination was not to reflect or evolve. It served to deflect and blame. They persuaded themselves that you were the issue. But deep down, they understood what was breaking them, didn't they? That was what you made them see. The truth is hazardous. When someone has constructed their whole identity around denial, it doesn't softly request permission to enter. It shatters what is untrue, allowing something genuine to emerge. However, some individuals are unwilling to accept reality. They like the mask, imagination, and sense of control. And when those illusions break, some individuals lose control over everything, even themselves. So no, you did not destroy them. The truth did. And all you did was stand within it. That is the power of the chosen one. You do not need to raise your voice to shake someone's foundation. All you have to do is enter the room, and the truth comes in with you. Number 6. They wanted access to your insight, not the traumas that gave rise to it. They admired your wisdom and ability to remain calm in the midst of turmoil. How you talked with depth, cutting through the cacophony. They called it elegance, maturity, and next-level energy. They appreciated your intelligence, insight, and ability to look through others like glass. But they didn't realize, and they refused to acknowledge, that none of it came cheaply. Every ounce of your insight was purchased with anguish. Every drop of clarity you have was gained in the dark. You didn't simply wake up and develop. You survived the fire, which they couldn't bear to hear about. They assumed your strength was inherent, as if you were born unaffected by hardship. But your power was not given to you. It was formed through betrayal, abandonment, loss, humiliation, spiritual assaults, and lengthy periods of stillness in which God did not speak but wanted you to act. They did not witness the evenings you sobbed yourself to sleep while encouraging others. They didn't see how you had to appear normal when your soul was shattering. They just saw the outcomes and concluded it was easy. So when others attempted to emulate your strength without experiencing your experience, it devastated them. They sought your ascension without exile, crown, crucifixion, oil, or crushing. But the truth depends on you. It came about via sacrifice, things you didn't publish, and things you still don't discuss. They assumed they could wear what was intended for you just because they appreciated it. But this calling is not about adulation. It's all about alignment. It's all about surrender. It's about being willing to be damaged so that you may carry something sacred. They were not willing. They just wanted the prize without the refinement. And this is why it didn't last. The weight of what you carried crushed them because it was never theirs to bear. They skipped the procedure. They skirted the breaking. They desired the fruit but rejected the starvation that caused its growth. And when they attempted to take what was holy, it crushed them. Because the wisdom you carry is not just derived from knowledge. It stems from wounds that became knowledge, scars that became scrolls, and torment that transformed you into a living testament. Number 7. Their spirits were starving in the midst of your satisfaction. You didn't need to say much. Simply being who you are was enough to let them feel the loneliness they had been avoiding. You did not flaunt anything. You were not bragging. But your serenity, sense of purpose, and silence stirred something deep inside them. Not because you were doing too much, but because you were being yourself, real, courageous, and free. And for someone who has created their identity upon need, affirmation, and relentless pursuit, being in the company of someone entire is oppressive. They weren't just bewildered by you. They were spiritually starved with you. Their spirit had been starved for years, living on attention, performance, material victories, and fleeting acceptance. They had persuaded themselves that success depended on appearing the part, maintaining a sense of wisdom while being active. But then you showed up, unconcerned, entrenched deeply, and you did more than simply make them feel noticed. You made them feel vulnerable since everything about you was disclosed. Everything they were not. You were not selling yourself. You were not hooked to being liked. You moved with meaning, not for acclaim. And that kind of satisfaction, which comes from inside, cannot be replicated. It has to be earned. It must be lived. However, they were unwilling to go to the lengths required to appear authentic. So, rather than being inspired, they became irritated. Instead of admiring your depth, they resented it because your life served as a mirror, revealing how far they had strayed from themselves. They tried to keep it cool, to hide the inner turmoil. But being around you made it impossible. Your peace disrupted their performance. Your calmness drowned out their chatter. Your confidence triggered their insecurities. And when they couldn't match your energy, they collapsed in silent resentment. They believed they could keep faking it. Continue to create a version of themselves that appeared successful, but felt hollow. But next to you, the mask fell because you weren't acting from ego. You were functioning from a position of alignment. And their spirit, which had been yearning for something genuine, couldn't live next to someone who had already discovered it. You did not murder them. The contrast did. Number 8. They broke when attempting to decode a frequency that they had not earned. You never broadcasted for attention. You radiated alignment. The frequency at which you function cannot be researched or imitated. It's won via cleansing, submission, and intense internal conflict. Most people would never survive, but they didn't think so. They believed that your energy might be hacked, like a signal, and used for their own gain. They did not come to study. They came to extract. But the problem about holy frequencies is that they cannot be reached with evil intents. They were drawn to you out of ego, jealousy, and motivations unrelated to personal development. And when they came too near, when they attempted to equal your frequency without matching your path, their system couldn't handle it. What they believed would empower them ended up short-circuiting them. Because your vibe is not appropriate for everyone. It is sacred, and anything filthy that attempts to tap in without permission receives backlash. They want access to what heaven provided without having to pay the cost of purification. They didn't realize that spiritual vibrations are more than simply music or presence. They are imprinted with duties, burdens, and responsibilities. You weren't just strolling with Farf. You were walking on fire. The glow they adored came with instructions, pressure, and a spiritual weight you were willing to bear. They were not. They just sought the perks. And when they pushed their way into something that demanded regard, they were greeted with something they weren't designed to handle. That is why they broke. Not because you have injured them. Not because you cursed them, but because holy energy protects itself. They were not allowed, thus the frequency rejected them. During the overload, they experienced anxiety, bewilderment, paranoia, and melancholy. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the outcome of an attempt to decipher anything without divine alignment. It is risky to access something you have not been educated to manage. And they discovered too late that what you carry cannot be duplicated, stolen, or confined by anybody who has not been crushed while carrying it. They attempted to seize what was sacred, but it backfired because they sought purity rather than power. And purity cannot be faked. Number 9, they played detective in a case that only God could solve. They were obsessed with your life and scrutinized every move you made as if it were evidence in court. They saw how you spoke, dressed, behaved, and remained calm when mayhem struck. They assumed if they paid close enough attention, they'd ultimately break your code and discover the flaw, the falsehood in your work. Because in their opinion, no one could be that genuine. Nobody could move with such assurance without faking it. So they manufactured you a case, which they were determined to solve. The trouble was that there was no case. You were not concealing anything. You were not putting on a show. You were just living in a grace that they could not grasp. They were walking with an untraceable covering. That was the source of their frustration. They sought for dirt but only saw growth. They searched for fissures but found only light. Every effort to expose you failed because they overlooked an important detail. God does not leave fingerprints. You are covered, spiritually encrypted. And what they were attempting to decrypt was written in heaven and not taught on earth. Their inquiry didn't just fail. It backfired because, while they were attempting to figure you out, they were exposed. Their aim, envy, and spiritual immaturity, everything began spilling out. They got obsessed with proving you weren't who you claimed to be, when the reality was you had never claimed anything. You were just being. That was too scary for someone who had established their identity. Their fixation with faking has become poisonous. What began as curiosity became competitiveness. What began as observing became into stalking, energy, emotional, and even spiritual, in an attempt to break you down. They disintegrated because the instant you choose your case study, you become the proof of your own failure. They believed they were being clever, that they'd break the code and feel strong, but all they shattered was their own foundation. You were not a mystery. You were just protected by something they never had access to. And in attempting to expose you, they exposed themselves. Number 10. They misunderstood your silence for simplicity. You did not move as they anticipated. You were not seeking attention. You didn't have to be the most vocal in the room to command it. You did not demonstrate your strength. But they sensed it. That puzzled them. They were used to individuals proving themselves, demanding to be noticed, and making noise in order to feel significant. But you were quiet, peaceful, and present. And that quiet led people to believe you were simple. They thought they had you figured out. They assumed that since you didn't flaunt it, you didn't have it. That's because you weren't always explaining yourself. You didn't have anything worth saying. But your quiet was not nothingness. There was depth. It was presence. It represented spiritual maturity. You didn't need to make an announcement since your enthusiasm spoke louder than your words. When they came near enough to plunge into your universe, anticipating something shallow, they discovered something old, layered, and bottomless. They were not prepared for it. They'd only ever swum in shallow seas, where everything is simple to manage and define. So when they delved into your quiet, anticipating ease, they were surprised to discover mystery, history, weight, divine insight, suffering converted into knowledge, and unconditional love. They weren't searching for the bottom, and there wasn't one. What they assumed was a pond turned out to be an ocean. And seas aren't fair to the unskilled. They felt they were prepared. They were not. You did not drag them beneath. They got lost attempting to establish their footing in an environment that required surrender rather than control. They weren't accustomed to seeing someone so quiet carrying so much thunder. But that is what happens when people make errors. Maintain calm in the face of weakness. You didn't say much, but what you did say had an impact. You didn't flaunt your might, yet it kept whole atmospheres in place. They did not drown because you were dangerous. They drowned because they overlooked the holy. They figured you were simple. Still, the seas are deep, and some hearts are not prepared for the depths they claim to crave. A number. Their soul broke beneath the weight of your call. They weren't just monitoring you. They were closed in, carefully studying, analyzing, comparing, and copying. At first, it seemed to be interest, but it was not adoration. It was an obsession based in spiritual restlessness. When they drew near to you, your calling began to push on something within of them. You did not ask for it. You weren't even attempting to impact them. However, holy energy has weight, and when it manifests, it challenges everything untrue in the room. That pressure, that change in the mood, was not arrogant. It was the authority of someone marching with divine purpose, and their soul couldn't withstand it. Your sheer presence triggered their worst anxieties. Fear of being irrelevant, of being neglected, of not having a purpose. It's your call. The way it handled itself without seeking confirmation revealed how distant they were from their own harmony. It triggered a desire in them. Instead, they chose self-reflection and comparison. This opened the door to jealousy. Jealousy created bitterness. And from that moment on, their soul was waging a struggle. It was not designed to win. They believed they could outdo you. Speak louder, glow brighter, and seem more powerful. But calling is not a competition. It's a commitment. And you didn't earn it by performance. You were formed in quiet, tested with fire, and honed in solitude. They didn't grasp that. So, although they were attempting to replicate your findings, they overlooked the refining process that enabled those outcomes. They wanted your influence, but not your integrity, elevation, or progress. But calling requires completeness, and anything based on ego cannot thrive in that environment. That is why their morale crumbled. Not because you cursed them, but because closeness to the true purpose reveals untapped potential. It accentuates everything that has never been relinquished. Everything was supported up by pride. When that holy tension struck between who they professed to be and what your presence revealed, they disintegrated. Not physically, but spiritually, emotional and mental. You did not destroy them. Your call did. And it was not personal. It was prophetic. Because light makes no apologies for revealing what darkness has concealed. And your life, path, and mission were never intended to console the counterfeit. It was intended to awaken the genuine, and whatever couldn't withstand that imploded number. They did not want answers. They want power over you. They never really sought to understand you. That is the fantasy they peddled. Asking probing questions, pretending attention, and appearing fascinated with your adventure. But behind it all, there was something darker. Control. They were not looking for solutions. They were seeking for a method. In order to come near enough to mimic, influence, and finally conquer what they secretly desired. This wasn't a curiosity. It was a subtle movement to assert power over things they couldn't understand. You were different in ways they couldn't understand. Not worried, yet not passive. Strong yet kind, intelligent without being pompous. That puzzled them. It presented a difficulty to them. They refused to recognize that your strength originated from something they couldn't produce. Instead of recognizing it, they attempted to possess it. They sought to figure you out as if you were a formula, reducing your spirit to a tactic. But heavenly design cannot be reverse engineered. What is sacred cannot be hijacked. When they realized they couldn't manage you, the tone changed. That phony politeness became frigid. That adulation turned into anger, since the aim was never to comprehend you. The objective was to disarm you, get near enough to analyze what made you divine, and exploit it for their own benefit. However, as they grabbed for the blueprint, it slid straight through their hands. Because what God has provided is not transferable via the ego. Their annoyance wasn't because you were complex. It was about you being invincible. Your soul refused to bend. Your limits remained strong. Your energy did not crumble under strain. And this kind of opposition infuriated them, since power-hungry individuals do not want to connect. They demand control. When dominance fails, obsession leads to devastation. They did not just seek answers. They wanted to be the source of your identity, the voice that formed you, and the force behind your success. But the selected ones do not move like puppets. You were already sealed, frigid, and claimed. So when their control efforts failed, the obsession escalated because they couldn't take it anymore. The one thing they couldn't control was you. And the truth. It broke them. A number. They perished attempting to compete in a conflict. They didn't realize you had already won. They walked into the arena beside you, believing it was a fair battle. I thought you were just learning how to throw fists, finding your equilibrium, figuring out who you were. They believed they had an advantage because they seemed stronger, spoke louder, or had more people behind them. What they didn't realize was that you had already bled in fights they would never win. You weren't just a warrior. You were created with fire. They misjudged you since you didn't arrive with a big tongue or a showy entrance. You went quietly, yet with a might of steel. They had no idea they were approaching someone who has previously fought conflicts on every level, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, while playing at combat. You had buried and resurrected portions of yourself several times. You'd learned how to win without the audience, how to heal without acclaim, how to rebuild from the ashes, without asking for pity. You understood the geography of misery as well as they did gossip. And there was the difference. They entered this conflict believing you were fresh to suffering. But anguish was your origin. Loss taught you the language of resiliency. Betrayal influenced your judgment. Abandonment carved your self-esteem. What seemed to be peaceful on the surface was a soul that had endured years of intense conflict, tear after tear. They did not just turn up late to the combat. They came there unarmed because, although they were contending for a crown, you were already crowned due to your scars. And since they assumed this was your first round, they were surprised by how quickly you stood up after each hit. They weren't expecting someone who didn't shatter like them. Every approach they used had worked on others, but not on you. You weren't just surviving. You were sealed, selected, and covered. And every time they hurled anything at you, it rebounded off a strength they had never idea existed. They believed they could win a conflict they did not comprehend. But you were born on the battlefield, and they perished. Not because you annihilated them, but because they misunderstood a skilled fighter for a simple prey. That was their last error. Number, your existence was the breaking down of their delusions. You never raised your voice. You were never a plotter. You never attempted to expose them. In actuality, you were just living truly softly and regularly. And that alone shattered their whole basis because your presence, raw and unfiltered, became the precise thing that rendered their carefully groomed falsehoods impossible to sustain. You did not need to do anything spectacular. Simply being genuine was enough to expose anything bogus. They had based their identities on. They perfected performance. They understood how to present themselves as the one who was cured, smart, and powerful. Their lives consisted on a series of masks worn for survival and acceptance. However, when you entered the frame, you mirrored something they could not fake: alignment, depth, and substance. You were not putting on a show. You were what they pretended to be. And the contrast was catastrophic for them. You never tried to outshine anybody, yet your light revealed what was always just glitter. The instant your reality collided with their act, the veneer started to shatter. They couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. Not around someone who has gone through genuine fire and survived. You were live evidence that pretending does not equal change. It comes from being smashed, sacrificed, and rebuilt by something greater than the ego. And they couldn't handle it. They'd spent years crafting a version of themselves that looked the part but lacked substance. Around you, they felt naked. Not because you condemned them, but because the truth requires openness, and they were not prepared to be seen. So, rather of rising to meet the vibration, they collapsed, attempting to fight it. They blamed you for their downfall, despite the fact that your presence simply made their fantasy difficult to maintain. You were never an issue. You were just the evidence. Proof that it is possible to recover from pain, to be honest and without shame, to be strong without performing. And for someone who has based their value on falsehoods, the truth does more than simply hurt. It shatters. They did not know how to exist without the illusion. So as it collapsed, they fell with it. It was never about you being dangerous. It was about you being unique. What that difference ignited in folks who had spent their whole lives hiding behind illusions. You did not destroy them with your hands. You demolished them with your presence. They weren't expecting to encounter someone who wasn't acting. Someone who has previously survived the fire that they were scared of even approaching. You did not fight them. They were warring with themselves. Your truth revealed their denial. Your mending exposed their wounds. Your survival caused their facade to fall beneath the weight of honesty. The sadness is that they could have learned from you. They might have healed with you. Instead of humbling themselves, they attempted to compete with something that had never played the same game. They recognized your calling and sought the crown, unaware of the cross that came with it. They entered hallowed land with impure intents, and it backfired horribly. Because when humans attempt to enter spiritual realms, they do not suffer because the strain breaks them. They're not weak, they're just unprepared. The fact is that they did not die while attempting to figure you out. They perished under the weight of their refusal to figure themselves out. You were a mirror, pure and unfiltered. And what they saw in their mirror was not something they could live with. So walk on, chosen one, not with remorse or burden, but with clarity. You never used a weapon, but your genuineness became one. Not to hurt, but to separate the genuine from the counterfeit. When truth enters the room, anything not anchored in it must fall. Let this be a reminder. You were never too much. They were just too dedicated to the falsehood. And some individuals cannot handle the truth, not because it murdered them, but it proved that they had never genuinely been alive. You are not here to be understood by everybody. You're here to be clearly authentic. Keep walking. You were made for this. If this speaks to you, don't simply scroll. Take action. Go ahead and subscribe, not just to support the channel, but also to remain connected to information that resonates with your truth, journey, and purpose. Like the video. If it rocked you within, leave a comment. If the soul shouted, finally someone stated it. Share this with someone who has been fighting quiet battles. Someone who needs to know they aren't insane. They are picked. Your participation doesn't merely help our platform develop. It helps to awaken others like you. Let us continue to establish this authentic community. Because in a noisy environment, the selected ones can identify frequency. Stay strong and present. Stay. You are just getting started. God bless you.